Hello, good morning. Today, our guest is Professor Padraic Scanlan, and we're going to be talking about slavery and revolts in the British West Indies. But before we do so, we're going to discuss peasantry. Padraic, who is a proto-peasant?
So proto-peasant is a term used in some of the scholarship about enslaved people in the Caribbean to refer to um, enslaved people who had access to land where they could grow their own crops. So the historian Michael Creighton, for example, referred to some slave rebellions as proto-peasant revolts, as being more like the revolts of say like a medieval European peasantry against their landlords than another sort of mode of revolution. So it's a way of thinking about the economic lives, I guess, of enslaved people before emancipation. And I think it's still a live question for historians as to whether or not it was possible to be a peasant or a proto-peasant under slavery, or whether or not uh, the kind of access to land that at least some enslaved people in the Caribbean had made them a peasantry or didn't.
Exactly, were slaves proto-peasant? And you discuss this issue in one of your articles. Slaves were not employees in a contemporary sense. Some slaves could earn. So slaves who were allowed to hire themselves out, they could earn, but those slaves were in the minority. So what was the distinguishing factor that really differentiated a slave from a peasant? Because in the 18th and 19th century, it wasn't unusual for people to conflate slavery and the European peasantry.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to give a little context. So you're right? So I think one of the things that I've tried to emphasize in my own work is that there were a lot of different kinds. Is that there were, I guess, there were degrees of economic autonomy among enslaved people, at least on Caribbean plantations. So at the kind of very bottom of the hierarchy were people who worked in the fields, right? Whose the condition of their enslavement was that they worked in sugarcane fields. But as you moved higher up the hierarchy, there were enslaved craftspeople. There were enslaved rangers who brought messages from one plantation to another. Enslaved drivers who sort of coerced gang laborers in the fields. And the higher up a person was on that hierarchy, the more likely they were to be able to earn income outside of the labor that they were compelled to do as a condition of enslavement. And so, I'm of two minds. I'm not convinced actually that the language of peasantry makes that much sense when thinking about enslaved people in the 18th and 19th centuries in the Caribbean. Not least because the land that enslaved people worked, that was supposed to be kind of the wellspring of their peasantness, if you will, were provision grounds, right, which were tended to be the worst, least valuable land on a plantation, that were kind of parceled off by landowners and given to enslaved people to use to grow crops for subsistence. So one of the things that I've been interested in is the way that the idea of enslaved people as a peasantry passed between slaveholders and abolitionists. And something that I've argued in my work is that initially slaveholders promoted the idea that enslaved people were in fact a peasantry, and that their role was not as the owners of chattel, but rather as kind of the patriarchs, the sort of stern but benevolent patriarchs of a huge extended family, and that enslaved people weren't working in what was, to my mind at least, a quasi-industrial and certainly energy and labor-intensive industry, but rather we're kind of working in this sort of rural idyllic setting. And that idea of enslaved people as peasants, which I would argue was promoted by slaveholders, then passed to abolitionists in the first half of the 19th century. And British abolitionists began to argue that what the Caribbean ought to be after emancipation would be a kind of peasant, a world of peasant agriculture, but neither side was really using peasant in the sense that economists meant the term, right? So slaveholders were saying enslaved people are peasants, and yet they're also, legally speaking, chattel. And abolitionists were saying, no, but enslaved people after emancipation could be peasants, but they still need to earn wages working in the sugar industry. So I think really that language of peasant obfuscates what both sides of the slavery and anti-slavery debate were actually arguing about, which was how labor in the plantation economy would be organized. Would it be organized as a low wage, as a kind of body of low wage proletarianized laborers working for wages on plantations, or would it be organized as a large body of enslaved laborers compelled to work for wages on plantations? I think
Padraic,
that, yeah,
Padraic, put provision grounds in context for our listeners.
sure. Okay, so provision grounds are a feature of many plantations, sugar plantations especially, in the British Caribbean. They're part of a provision ground would be a part of a sugar plantation that was, rocky or on a hillside, or generally unsuited to growing sugarcane. So it wouldn't be the kind of best land for sugarcane growing on a plantation, and instead it would be assigned to enslaved people as a garden, right? Basically to grow provisions for subsistence. And the system began as a way for slaveholders to save money, right? Rather than importing provisions, the enslaved workforce could be made to grow them. But that expedient that started in the early days of the plantation economy in the late 17th and early 18th century became a kind of permanent feature of many plantations. And the provision grounds produced not only food for subsistence, but also sometimes food that was sold as a surplus. And so there are a strange kind of paradox within the economy of the British Caribbean in the era of slavery, because they are parcels of land that were not in a legal sense, but in a kind of meaningful moral sense, owned by enslaved people. And often there's also at least some evidence that they were passed down from generation to generation, like landed property would be. But at the same time, they were, it was in a sense property that was at least by custom owned by enslaved people who were themselves, legally speaking, considered to be property, right? So it was property owned by people who were considered to be property. And they were a really important feature of the plantation economy. And they were also really of substantial scholarly interest, especially to anthropologists led by the anthropologist Sidney Mintz in the 1950s and 1960s.
Yes. Padraic, I bought your book and I read it. Your latest book. Yes, I read it and I really like not the paragraph, the chapter Money, Wealth and Debt.
Okay.
Yeah, because
Okay.
in that chapter we discuss the slave economy and how slaves were able to inherit, well, not substantial wealth, but they did inherit assets from relatives, as you put in your book. These assets were transmitted across kin groups. And what was I found this segment in your book to be quite interesting when you said that some slaves, when they died, it was revealed that they had around 200 pounds. Back then, that was a lot of money, especially for an enslaved person.
Yes.
So I'm
Yeah.
interested in how slaves proved to be quite productive, despite the fact that policies were created to restrict their participation in the market.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's partly one of the ways that enslaved people were able to accumulate money was partly just through the way that white planter society used money. So slaveholding planters were among, at least in the 18th century, some of the wealthiest people in the British Empire. But a lot of their wealth wouldn't have been in cash. It would have been sort of in paper, credit instruments, or in property, right? There wasn't a lot of specie that was actually changing hands in the Caribbean. Almost everything was paid for in treasury bills or in promissory notes or in other kind of instruments of credit. So a lot of the silver and copper money that circulated in the Caribbean wasn't actually circulating among slaveholders or their employees, their sort of waged white employees, but rather among enslaved people. And one of the, I argue in the book, at least, that one of the ways that at least some enslaved people accumulated income was through selling the surplus of provision grounds, which would have been in small enough quantities that it would have been something that would have been paid for in cash. And the 18th century historian of Jamaica, Edward Long, and I'm not sure, I've never seen this anywhere else, but in Edward Long's History of Jamaica, argued that almost all of the silver and copper money circulating in Jamaica in the 18th century was in the hands
Yes, I am familiar with that quote too, by Edward Long. And for Barbados, we also have first-hand sources that were written by observers at the time. I'm always fascinated by the productivity of enslaved workers. It was I can't imagine being a slave. That was not easy. But despite the hardships, I'm not going to call them successful because the hardships were innumerable, but despite the hardship, they still achieved financially. And Justin Roberts, he has an excellent article on the slave elite. So he talks about Old Doll and other slave professional families, and how they perpetuated intergenerational wealth until Old Doll's family demise. So I'm really interested in that part of history.
I mean, one of the things that I tried to emphasize in Enslaved Empire is the way that the idea of civilization and promoting civilization was something that was central to the anti-slavery movement in Britain. And civilization was an incredibly vague and inchoate concept. And it could sort of mean whatever the people promoting it wanted it to mean in context. But at least in my view, one consistent, stable meaning of civilization across time was evidence among colonized people of behaving according to the kind of basic economic rules of British society, right? So saving money, earning wages, participating in the market economy. And so one of the things that, at the same time, one of the things that the British abolitionist movement was broadly, I think, persuaded of was the idea that enslavement had set back enslaved people economically in time. So in the moment of emancipation in August 1st, 1834, enslaved people became apprentices, and they became or most enslaved people became apprentices, and they became apprentices in part because British abolitionists were persuaded that they needed a period of education in order to learn how to behave according to the rules of the market. And so one of the things that I've looked at in the book and that I wish I had done a little bit more on, and I think there's a lot more research to be done on, is on the process of valuation of apprentices. So apprentice laborers were required to work for a fixed period of time without wages for the people who had once claimed to own them. But they could buy out the term of their apprenticeship after a period of valuation. And some of the valuations that magistrates gave to the labor of apprentices were very expensive. So like, hundreds, 150 pounds, which 150 pounds was a very, very substantial amount of money in 1836. And yet many apprentices were able to pay that money. And so to my mind, in that period in the Caribbean, there were either people advancing apprentices that money or they already had it. And either way, it was either putting the most productive apprentices deeply in debt as a condition of their freedom, or it was stripping them of all of their savings. And so one of the things that I think there are a lot of features of the era of slavery that the abolitionist movement sort of unconsciously absorbed and reproduced in emancipation policies. And I think that there's a ton more historical research to be done, I think, about the way that money circulated.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah.
And do you know what should also be researched, Padraic? the black middle class during slavery. Many of the books on free people of color in the Caribbean are really good, but they're just so old. Like God Human's book is a bit old. Jerome Andler's book is a bit old. Many of the articles are also really old. We don't know enough about middle class people of African descent in the Caribbean. And
Yes,
based on what I've been reading, I wouldn't refer to them as numerous, but the figure is actually larger.
yeah. Look, I look. You're definitely right about that. I mean, I think there's, there are figures in my own work who crop up. There's a man named Edward Lyons who becomes a special magistrate who's of mixed European and African descent. There's Edward Jordan, who's the publisher of
Yes.
a major.
There was Richard Hill. Richard Hill was a prominent Jamaican of mixed descent, really respected.
Yeah, I know. I think you're definitely right. It's part of the reason why. I mean, I would speculate that some of that research is sort of waiting to be done, is because historians have, until I think fairly recently, been very, and I'm sort of guilty of this myself in my own work, of focusing a lot on the countryside in the Caribbean rather than on the cities, right? And I think that cities and towns were the centers of the free, like the community of free people of color in most of Britain's Caribbean colonies. And I think that there's a lot of, like, in Caribbean newspapers, right there from the 18th century, I think is a source that are is a body of sources that are underexplored by historians. But you're right, that is a fairly substantial gap in our understanding of the British Caribbean, especially in the 18th century.
But thankfully, your book explored Francis Williams, a Jamaican intellectual who studied in England. I don't know if he actually went to Cambridge, but he attended a prominent school in England and was certified. I'm not sure about the Cambridge part, but Francis Williams was educated, lived in St. Catherine, and owned slaves.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's one of the. Yeah, Francis Williams is a really interesting figure. Also, had his portrait painted, published the series of odes. He was really litigious. So there are a lot of records because he sued a lot. Often, I mean, on the one hand, right, like I think you can see into the lives of people like Williams through his lawsuits, because first of all, in terms of his sort of life as a tutor and as a slaveholder and as an entrepreneur within the colonial Caribbean of the 18th century, but also, most of his lawsuits were for libel or slander. And most of the libel or slander had to do with his race, right? So he was constantly suing people who were refusing to extend to him the legal rights that he enjoyed as a free person, and they were doing that because of, yeah. So I think, yeah, there's a ton of more work to be done, and I think that there is a really complicated and interesting history there.
And what's also fascinating is how these people were able to transmit intergenerational wealth. We still don't know enough about the scalability of enterprise in the Caribbean. And Douglas Hall, a Jamaican academic now deceased, he wrote a book, Free Jamaica. And in that book, he details various commercial activities in the Caribbean after, not in the Caribbean, in Jamaica after abolition. And it's obvious that the environment was not conducive to scaling businesses. So it didn't really, it didn't matter if the business was started by a middle class white person, a rich American, or a black person. The propensity for it to scale was limited.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, partly, especially if the business wasn't sugar production, right? I think that sugar production um, lent itself to a certain kind of expansion across the Atlantic. So many of the most prominent sugar planters also owned shipping companies or sugar refineries in the UK, right, where it was easier to reinvest the profits of sugar planting because I mean, it's important to remember, I think, how single-mindedly extractive sugar planting was, and how little, beginning in the 17th century and moving into the 18th century, how little most sugar planters thought about anything related to the kind of long-term viability of their business, right? So the road systems were really poor. Shipment, all things that would have gone across roads on other islands in the British Empire would go by boat in much of the British Caribbean. The roads were extremely poorly maintained. There was very little kind of parish level or district level infrastructure. Everything, as I see it, at least in the sugar industry in the 18th century, was built up around exhausting the soil by growing sugar and selling it as quickly as possible. And so consequently, that attitude, I think, to extraction meant that it was pretty difficult in the wake of emancipation to build up any kind of substantial business, right? Because there was no infrastructure to support it. And as free trade came to the empire in the 1840s, even the sugar industry became unprofitable in the Caribbean. By the late 1830s, 1840s, sugar planters in the Caribbean were held up, were being propped up by protectionist legislation. And as soon as they faced competition from sugar beets and also from other European empires that still had enslaved labor, and that moreover were deploying enslaved labor on land that had not yet been used for sugar production in places like Brazil or Cuba, the British imperial sugar industry collapsed.
But
And
we can answer this question by doing a rigorous comparative analysis using Barbados and other colonies. So you, in your paper, you wrote about the notion of the planter ideal, but the planter ideal was not unique to Barbados. Even in Jamaica, people were reading planter guides. There were societies to improve agricultural production and invest in research. But the Bayesians, they appear to be a bit successful. So Douglas Hall in his book mentioned that the Bayesians were successful, and later research has also confirmed the early arguments of Hall. But what was the real difference between Barbados and other colonies? Because in other colonies, planters were reading European booklets and they had manuals and various societies for intellectual men.
Yeah. I mean, I'm starting to stray beyond necessarily what I know really deeply in terms of but so I'll have to speak in, and I don't want to commit to something that I'm not
Don't worry.
persuaded of.
None of us really
But
know
I
this
would say
topic.
part of the difference in the planter class in Barbados versus other islands is just geography. So Barbados was one of the first sugar colonies in the British Empire. It was also among the first to be to experience substantial soil exhaustion. So by in some sense, like geographic and environmental necessity made Barbados sugar planters more likely to invest in agricultural improvement rather than the strategy in places like Trinidad or British Guyana, places where there was enough arable land that if sugar land became exhausted, and you were a sugar planter, you could just buy more land or move your plantation, right? You could, whereas in Barbados, the island was almost completely deforested, by the early 18th century, mostly for use as fuel in sugar production. And so, I think in some ways, like necessity was not the mother of invention, because I think Barbados sugar planters were not necessarily innovators, but at least the necessity of experimentation and interest in agricultural improvement elsewhere. And Barbados was also a place where I write a little bit in Slave Empire about a man named Joshua Steele,
Yes.
who was a sort of I think by the
A
standard,
progressive man, as some would say.
yeah. I mean, I think as by the standards among sugar planters in the late 18th century, he was certainly considered to be an eccentric and an outsider. He inherited his property. He wasn't born into one of the planter families. He inherited it through a marriage. And he wasn't particularly well liked, but he experimented in the late 18th century with reviving Anglo-Saxon legal traditions of limited freedom, things like villeinage, the sort of pre-Black Death institution of serfdom in England. And he imagined a way of sort of easing the process of the passage from slavery to freedom with this kind of way station in the middle that he drew from England's sort of late antique and early medieval past. And he was a fairly obscure figure until his writings were rediscovered by abolitionists and then republished. So a series of letters that he wrote were published in the early 19th century under the auspices of an anti-slavery press. And so Joshua Steele was latched onto by Thomas Clarkson, the famous British abolitionist, as a kind of lawgiver and an inspiration for emancipation. Although the degree to which Clarkson, in retrospect, the degree to which Clarkson really believed that versus the degree to which Clarkson was looking for a slaveholder who had supported emancipation. When I think on it now, I think I may have attributed a little bit too little guile in the book to Clarkson, because Clarkson was otherwise a very, very shrewd propagandist. And I'm not sure to what extent Clarkson really took Steele as an example for emancipation as much as he took Steele as a really useful example of a fairly wealthy, well-to-do slaveholder in Barbados opting for emancipation without legal compulsion. When I think on it now.
Patrick, so I interviewed Orlando Patterson some time ago, and I shared my thoughts with him, and he laughed. Maybe he's willing to research the idea, but could it be possible that Barbados is different from other colonies because one, there was a greater appropriation of European institutions by the elite in Barbados, and two, many of the slaves who went to Barbados, especially in the early years, they came from southern Nigeria. They are of Igbo descent, and the Igbos are known for entrepreneurship. During slavery, they were prone to commit suicide. However, don't get me wrong, in Jamaica, there were Igbo revolts. During colonialism, the Igbos revolted. The Igbos will revolt, but their culture is prone to planning. So I read a book. Yes, it was Jerome and Andler, and there was a quote from somebody saying that these women in Barbados, the black women, they are proud people, they have pride. So could it be possible that Barbados is different from other colonies because it was settled by a different type of black and white person, people who are not necessarily so prone to aggression?
I mean, I'm pretty skeptical of that.
You're skeptical. Okay.
Yeah, I don't. I'm not. Look, I am definitely receptive to the idea that enslaved people coming from different parts of the West African coast carried with them different kinds of cultural traditions. And I think that that's sort of irrefutable. I'm skeptical in part because I think a lot of the information that we know about where enslaved people came from is often very patchy. So there was something that I read about Enslaved Empire a bit is the obsession with the Coromantee, right? Who are, I guess, a Akan speaking or an Akan language family speaking group. But they don't really like the people in the British West Indies were both white slaveholders, like desired enslaved people who they believed to be Coromantee because they thought they were hard workers.
Yeah, that they were skilled people.
Yeah, but at the same time were suspicious of them because they were known as being prone to revolt. But that like ethnic group was in many ways invented by slaveholders,
Yes,
right?
because it was named after a fort.
Right, exactly. So I am not, like, I'm in the kind of sort of schematic sense, I am open to arguments about the origins of enslaved people affecting the trajectory of plantation life or the formation of um, societies and cultures among enslaved people. But I'm just suspicious of the data. Um, so I would, yeah, I'm broadly skeptical, although I'm sure, Orlando Patterson probably knows a lot more
Yes, yeah.
than I do in terms of the comparative framework. But it would, that would be an interesting question to ask of a scholar who works on something like the Slave Voyages database, the huge publicly accessible database of the transatlantic slave trade. And I know that there is a companion database that has just launched or will soon launch, related to using the records of the slave trade and also of the abolition movement to kind of reconstruct the origins of enslaved people and to try to make the kinds of comparative arguments that you're proposing, but also kind of get a clear sense of the data first. So yeah, no, I'm skeptical, but I'm open to that sort. Like I
Yeah,
think
it's a
that sort of
topic that
argument.
I am presently researching. I'm doing a lot of research on the Igbo people. And based on what I am reading, it's not surprised that the culture of Barbados, even today, differs from other Caribbean countries because, as I said, the planter elite in Barbados acted differently. And the slaves revolted, but they also acted differently. The bourgeois mindset in Barbados trickled down. It was not only planters who had a bourgeois mindset, but even enslaved people. And you hinted at this in your book when you said that in Barbados there was a revolt, and then after the revolt was suppressed, we saw a flag, and you detailed the imagery in your book. So when I read that part of your book, I said clearly clearly in Barbados there was a greater bourgeois sentiment. Or Padraic? Padraic? I guess that
I think you've cut out.
yeah. So you're back now. So we're
Okay,
silent
great.
for a bit, but we're back. So we're going to talk
Okay.
briefly about this. The Akan. So in the 1670s, there was a revolt in Barbados led by Akan slaves, and it was betrayed by a woman. Was her name Anna or Anna?
I would have to check my
I think
notes,
her
but
name
yeah,
was Anna. Yeah. So
that's what happened, right? It was one of there's a famous. I mean, I'm sure there were a lot of other um, small or large scale rebellions especially in the 17th century, when uh, the Caribbean was much less militarized in the 17th century, and most of the colonies that would become Britain's most profitable sugar producing colonies were kind of places where adventurers were kind of striking out to try to make as much money as they could, as quickly as they could. But yeah, there's a quite a famous pamphlet called I think Wonderful News from Barbados, or Wondrous News from Barbados, that relates the story of a rebellion that was in the offing until allegedly, or at least in the pamphlet, an enslaved woman kind of tipped off the authorities that it was about to happen.
and this will be my last point before we wrap up. You don't need to respond, but Shaw Park. So you educated us about Shaw Park in 1834, and I'm talking about Shaw Park because the Maroons from Akongpong and Scotch Hall, they were used as agents to provide the colonialists with information about about prospective runaways. And you have also done work on the Maroons. Yeah,
Yeah,
some people find it difficult to understand why the Maroons, as Black people, would suppress slave revolts, own slaves, and work as agents for the British, both in Jamaica and in Africa.
Yeah, I mean, I think my look, I have no idea what it would be like, as you said before, right? Like in some ways, the the like chattel slavery is in some like in some it's sort of impossible to imagine in a what it would be like to be enslaved, especially in the kind of uniform kind of chattel slavery that persisted across the Atlantic world. But I would argue like the Maroons made a deal, right? And they what they did was they secured the freedom for themselves and for their descendants in exchange for collaboration with slaveholders.
They were being
Um,
rational based on the standard of the era. They were being rational. I
yeah,
won't judge them too much.
yeah, exactly right. Like there's not, there were moments when, there were moments when the Maroon Wars tipped, and there were many across many different British colonies, but sort of the most famous ones are the Maroon Wars of the 1730s and 1740s in Jamaica. Um, and there were moments when the Maroon Wars were tipping in favor of the Maroons, but there were always going to be more soldiers, especially after the militarization of the Caribbean, right? Like in the end, a group of Maroons couldn't defeat the power of the British Empire in the mid 18th century. So I think the choice for the Maroons was a kind of impossible choice, right? It was freedom or enslavement, or freedom or death, right? Like so I think they made a choice to um like yeah, there's a book called All, and then in the end, like that collaboration, I mean, was always betrayed. You know what I mean? Like there's no, like, one thing that the British Empire did not do consistently anywhere across its entire empire in the 18th century is honor the kinds of agreements that it made with um, colonized people who agreed to assist the empire in some way, right? Like you can see the in 1783, right, the settlement that portioned off a huge swath of North America for Britain's indigenous allies in the war against France, and in this, especially in the 7 Years' War, right? Like Britain reneged on those deals right away, as soon as it was convenient. And I think it's the same with the Maroons. And one of the reasons why for the expulsion of the Trelawney Maroons in the late 18th century was that they felt that Britain had backed out of the agreement that it had made with their ancestors. And so they went to war again. And the consequence was they were defeated, and then exiled first to Nova Scotia and then to Sierra Leone. So, I think the story of the Maroons is in some ways like a kind of tragic story, right? They were in a position that was impossible and untenable, and their eventual defeat was, in my view at least, inevitable. And so they did what they had to do to survive, and hold on to what they had.
All right. So thanks, Patrick. I am going away. But before I go, I'm going to say this. The British revoked earlier treaties. A contemporary example is Windrush, the victims of the Windrush generation. But we're wrapping up, so we can't talk about it again. But that's
All
a
right. Well, thank you
classic
very much.
example.
Yeah,
All
I think
right.
you're right.
Bye, Patrick.
All right. Thank you very much. Bye now.